Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. Hi, I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Island families. This evening's edition will host Legislative Issues with Jim Parisi, where we bring the legislature into your living room. We hope you enjoy this edition of Legislative Issues and Labor Vision.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly right into your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field rep with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I'm your host this evening. Today we continue our discussion of legislative issues, and we're going to tackle something a little more esoteric than other issues that we've dealt with on Labor Vision, and we're going to be talking about the Constitutional Convention. I'm pleased to have Paula Hodges with us today as our guest. Paula, thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
So we've worked together. You're with Planned Parenthood. I'm with the labor movement and other community groups to work on this Constitutional Convention issue. But before we get into the con, tell us what you do for Planned Parenthood.
Sure, happy to. I'm the Governmental Relations Director for Planned Parenthood of Southern New England here in Rhode Island. So I oversee all of our public affairs and outreach work. I oversee a community organizer. I lobby in the legislature against bad bills and to promote a good coalition package. I also help coordinate elections work to help elect supportive state elected officials. We have a lot of coalition partners at the Reproductive Justice Coalition, and we work to engage youth and college students as well around reproductive justice issues.
Do you deal just with Rhode Island when you do your legislative work, or you spend some time in Mass as well?
I am solely dedicated to Rhode Island. We've got our hands full here. But Planned Parenthood of Southern New England actually encapsulates Connecticut and Rhode Island. We have 18 health centers between our two states. We serve over 70,000 patients annually between the two states, and we have one health center in Rhode Island on Point Street.
So how long have you been with Planned Parenthood?
I am approaching my 2.5-year anniversary here in the Ocean State. I started right before the holidays in 2011 and have really enjoyed my tenure here. I moved here from Missouri for the position. So I debunked the theory that young people don't come to Rhode Island to find their careers. I've been very happy in my work here.
And what did you do before you worked for Planned Parenthood?
I was the political director for Missouri NEA, the National Education Association in Missouri, and worked in Jefferson City in that state capital. We call it a capital, not a state house. That was my first lesson when I moved to Rhode Island. And did a lot of political coordination, especially around school board elections, because in Missouri, collective bargaining is left to the school districts to determine. So you have to elect supportive school board committees in order to have collective bargaining agreements.
So you've always worked on the intersection of legislation as well as politics.
Yeah, that's become my niche, and it's definitely an exciting field to work in.
So now let's talk about the Constitutional Convention. First of all, what is a Constitutional Convention, and why should our viewers even care about the issue?
That is an excellent question. Being from Missouri, I had a somewhat of familiarity with constitutional conventions. About 13 states, aside from Rhode Island, have a constitutional requirement to go to the ballot ever so often. In the case of Rhode Island, every 10 years, a question gets put before the voters to ask, should there be a constitutional convention? And if the voters say yes, it sets in motion a series of processes by which a special set of delegates based on House districts get elected.
So this issue of whether or not we want a constitutional convention is already going to be on the ballot?
Yes. So in 2014, it could appear on the ballot in one of two ways. The legislature could pass a motion to send it to the ballot in November to appear in the general election, or the Secretary of State could put it onto the ballot. And I believe the Secretary of State is already committed to saying he would put it on the ballot. So we're planning as though it will appear on the November 2014 ballot.
So what issues that we care about, that community partners care about, labor unions would care about, even come up in something called the Constitutional Convention?
Absolutely. We should all care very much about the implications of a Constitutional Convention. The last time a state called for one was actually Rhode Island in 1984. They voted to have one, and the Constitutional Convention met in 1986. And it set in motion a very convoluted process that ended up being what I would call a politicians' convention, in which at the time 100 delegates had to be elected in a special election that was very low turnout in order to go to Providence and make really important decisions about constitutional amendments that would have a deep impact on our governmental systems and processes here.
So there were 100 delegates back in '86 because there were 100 representative districts. So if it passed now, we have 75 representative districts. Is that how many delegates we'd have?
Exactly. We would have 75 delegates based on our House apportionment, and anybody could run. So past lawmakers, current lawmakers, lobbyists, family members of elected officials could run. In 1986, there were 7 former lawmakers who ran, and I believe 4 or 5 family members of lawmakers, including the speaker's kids at the time. So based on our past knowledge of what's happened during these constitutional conventions, although one might say it's an alternative to the legislative process, we believe that the same actors who are involved in lobbying and impacting public policy in the legislature would very much have a high and heavy influence on the Constitutional Convention.
So as we sit here today, we've just had a speaker whose office has been searched, and we're undergoing a change in leadership on the House. So there might be people who would argue that there's some things wrong with government. We maybe need to change certain things. Don't you need a constitutional convention to change how we govern here in Rhode Island?
We understand and hear the fact that people are unhappy with their elected officials and politicians, and believe that the regular elections process through which we elect our state legislators and governor, statewide elected officials, could work better if more people were involved and more people ran. The problem with the Constitutional Convention, frankly, is you're dealing with special elections that may occur in the spring. Unclear, that would be up to the governor, I believe, to make that determination. Would involve very low turnout elections, a lot of confusion about the purpose, and these delegates would not be held accountable to being reelected. They go in, they have their convention, and then they're done. They can wash their hands of it. So the accountability that we believe we have over our current legislature doesn't even exist for the Constitutional Convention.
I imagine some special interests with deep pockets could have a whole lot of influence over who's elected delegate in a small state like Rhode Island with just 1 million people.
Absolutely. My background in Missouri was working against ballot initiatives, and we saw untold millions of dollars coming in to fight citizen or to promote what are called voter initiatives. The Constitutional Convention would be kind of like a voter initiative process, but on steroids, in that they are unlimited in what kinds of topics they can take up. So in 1986, unfortunately, reproductive health and abortion were at the heart of the convention, and they attempted to put one of the first personhood amendments in the country on the ballot, and they did. They put it on the ballot, and the voters voted it down 2-1 after a very intensive campaign. What we know and what we're seeing in other states where there are voter initiatives, we're seeing minorities and women really being negatively impacted through these processes, and we believe that any out-of-state interest or in-state interest that has hundreds of thousands of dollars laying around could influence to get constitutional amendments put on the ballot, especially in light of Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that said corporations are people and they can spend an unlimited amount of money to influence elections. I just believe that the Constitutional Convention is a great risk for our civil liberties, for reproductive rights, for labor, certainly collective bargaining rights, and a whole slew of other social issues.
I know the labor movement has seen in recent years in states that have voter initiative, ballot initiatives that deal with right to work, ballot initiatives that deal with paycheck deception and whether or not you can even have dues deduction if you work in the public sector. There's all sorts of threats to worker rights in ballot initiative states. Is that important when you think about whether or not we want a constitutional convention here in Rhode Island?
Absolutely. I think some people will say, well, this isn't the same as voter initiative. No, it's not. But once you convene a convention, you can't limit what they're going to put on the ballot. And frankly, if I were an out-of-state special interest who wanted to pass right to work or paycheck deception, it would be a pretty good bargain for me to come in, influence 35, 40 delegate elections, get people into a convention, and then get these constitutional amendments out there in one fell swoop. It is a very discerning process, I think, and a lot of people assume that good-spirited government reformers are going to run for these seats and win. And what we know is politicians who are expert at running elections will be the ones with the upper hand in running for these delegate seats. And having the backing of special interest will certainly sway what topics they take up in our convention.
So any kind of government reform can come out of a constitutional convention. Say I'm a person who wishes there was a more accountable assembly by going back to 2-year terms, for all office holders, and instead of just the assembly members or something along those lines. What means can someone who wants to change how our government works make those kinds of changes without a constitutional convention?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion about how we can affect change in transparency in government. The number one way we can affect change is to elect progressive and supportive state legislators, House members and Senate members, and a governor. And actually, in recent years, when the state of Rhode Island has done some good government reforms, like shrinking the size of the state house from 100 to 75 and changing the term limits from 2 to 4 years for statewide office holders, that was done through legislative process. So where we can be heard on the ground in lawmakers' districts, they have the ability to do the right thing and make these reforms. And we can do that every year when we're in the State House. It doesn't have to wait for this decennial process.
So the General Assembly can put things on the ballot, and we can change our Constitution that way. And in fact, the recent years of the Rhode Island General Assembly says they're amenable to changing our Constitution. We've done it a few times, haven't we?
Absolutely. So we certainly hope that that's the track we can take to make things better in the Ocean State. Again, having a constitutional convention can open up a really ugly can of worms. It's a costly process. It's for the state to have to fund this additional convention, but it's also will become a very costly process for our constituents, for women, for union members, retirees. It's a Pandora's box that we haven't seen open since 1986, and there's a reason for that, and there's a reason why there have been 26 statewide votes taken in other parts of the country where voters said no to this idea because they understood how dangerous this was.
So the last constitutional convention in a state was in Rhode Island back in '86?
Yes. Yep.
Something to be said for stability, I imagine.
Guess so, I suppose.
So your organization has your set of issues. I know the labor movement has some serious reservations about the threats to worker rights with the Constitutional Convention. What kinds of other organizations are you seeing coming together to raise concerns about a Constitutional Convention? Certainly.
There are a lot of nonprofit advocacy groups who are thinking around the clock about the Pandora's box of winding back the clock on civil rights, on women's rights, minority rights. So we're reaching out to our brothers and sisters in the labor community, to civil liberties groups like the AFL-CIO. We're certainly talking with other advocate groups that care about advancing immigration reform, looking at progressive revenues for the state so that working families aren't constantly taking it on the chin when the economy's not improving here. So we believe this issue, the Constitutional Convention, affects everybody, seniors, young people, minorities. What we see time and time again in states that have voter initiative or send amendments to the ballot, they hurt those who are most vulnerable. So people who are already underrepresented, low income, minority, women workers, who may not have access to what they need in our current system, let alone after some really radical right ballot initiative comes through that tries to defray healthcare reform or immigration reform. So that's who we're talking to, anybody and everybody we can, and we think at the end of the day there will be a broad coalition of diverse voices that will stand up against this.
And when I think about what happened just last year in terms of the biggest bill that passed the Assembly was the marriage equality bill. Could something like that get undone at a constitutional convention?
Absolutely. That should be front of mind for most people. I know that probably seems like ages ago when we passed marriage equality, not quite a year ago. But absolutely for folks who didn't want to see that come to pass, they could easily attempt to roll back equal rights for LGBTQ communities in the same way that they could attempt to put measures on the ballot that would affect minimum wage, affect access to health care, especially reproductive rights. We see it time and time again in states like Mississippi and Colorado. I know that many Rhode Islanders feel like, well, we're not Mississippi or Colorado, but the same outside players can come in and do exactly what they're doing in those states right here.
So if you're concerned about civil rights, worker rights, reproductive rights, whatever thing you want to protect, what's the best way to stop a constitutional convention from happening in the first place?
It's a great question. Hopefully, if you are a union member or you're a member of one of our organizations, supporter of a community group, get involved, make your voice heard, contact your lawmaker and make your voice heard, but certainly vote on November 4th against the Constitutional Convention question and talk to your friends about it. You'll be hearing more about our work, I think, in the coming months to educate the public and educate our elected officials about why this is a high-stakes game that we just can't afford to lose.
I've got to imagine it's going to be a challenge getting voters' attention focused on an issue like Constitutional Convention when we're going to have a very active race for our governor, we're going to have a very active set of General Assembly races. You know, how do you focus attention on an issue like a government reform process when you have all these other things going on in Rhode Island politics?
That's always the challenge, staying focused and having a consistent message. To your point of it being a busy cycle with the gubernatorial race, no doubt, we've seen that already in the last 3 to 6 months. Everybody's focused on who's next. What I would say about our organizations and community being focused on defeating a constitutional convention is the long-lasting impact of a con gone awry has a much deeper impact than perhaps one gubernatorial administration. So we know that altering our state constitution to roll back rights could have a far larger unilateral impact than just one gubernatorial race. However, it's important that all the candidates who are running this year and incumbent lawmakers understand what's at stake with the Constitutional Convention, and we hope to talk about that with them over the course of the next 8 months of this campaign.
I can imagine there are some people who, even though they understand the concern, they still see some opportunity. And quite frankly, when I was asked about this issue back in the fall, I said I'm opposed to a constitutional convention, but if it passes, I'm running. You know, as a union member in Johnston in District 43, I intend to be on the ballot. Isn't that an expensive way to protect your rights? You know, going through a ballot question and then running delegates and then having to deal with what happens at the convention. It could be good or bad, but it's certainly going to be expensive either way to preserve what you've got.
There's certainly going to be a cost to the state to put it on, and a cost for individuals to run. And I would say that if we had a high bench of individuals who are wanting to run for office, we might be doing a better job in getting those folks to run for state legislature. Recruiting people to run to be delegates will be challenging. But to your point, if we were to lose and a constitutional convention process is set in motion for the first time in over 30 years, we would certainly be encouraging all of our supporters in every district to run, to attempt to make sure that the outcome is positive for worker rights and women. But let's take it one step at a time. Let's hope we don't get there quite yet.
Paula, I appreciate you coming into the studio and educating our viewers on this really important constitutional issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision, where we bring the Assembly right into your living room.
Well, we got a lot to do, so we got to keep fighting. And I've just a few comments before we move along. I don't think it'd be appropriate if I didn't say a few things, but just have a few concepts to throw out at you. One is that we have to use our economic power in a much greater way than we do now. And what I mean by that is what we did here tonight. We have an event at a union facility that keeps union members working. You gotta pay your bills by mail. Don't use an ATM machine. Go to the Rhode Island Credit Union. Don't use a checkout, the automatic checkout in the supermarket. Keep somebody working. If you have a union office, have the trash removal in the office cleaned by union members. Make sure your printing's all union. Think of the economic power we have, 100,000 union members and their families. What if each one of us moved $1,000 to unions' goods and services instead of non-union? That's $100 million into the Rhode Island economy to build up the labor movement. We have to think, use our power. We can keep our own members working and we can grow our membership that way. Another thing, just a pet peeve. Have you ever been pissed off when they call us a special interest? I mean, that just drives me crazy. Special interest. Look at our agenda. Look what we fight for. Look who we fight for, not just our own members. The minimum wage, workers' compensation, the job that Armin did. Back in 1990, we have the best workers' compensation in the city. That helps union and non-union members. Unemployment insurance, TDI, education, health care, the bond issues that we work for. We're not a special interest. So I would ask you to do one thing. The next time someone says that, say, no, we're not a special interest. We're the people's lobby. That's what we have to get the message across. We are the people's lobby. We can no longer allow ourselves to be called a special interest. We know what the special interests are. They're the people who wanted this country shut down just recently. They're the banks, the insurance companies, the financial institutions. They care about just a small thing. How much more profit can they make? We are the people's lobby. We are no longer ever going to be called a special interest. And that's what our vow is to leave here tonight with. The other thing, and we say it all the time, but we have to remind ourselves about it. There is no middle class without the American labor movement. As we go, so does the vast majority of working people in our country, and we have to remind people of that. If we don't have a strong labor movement, this country will go to hell in a handbasket, and it's heading in that direction. We got to rebuild the labor movement because that's the only way we're going to have and maintain the middle class. I just want to say one thing about power. That's a word that a lot of people are afraid of. And they say we have too much power. Well, we know we don't because we live it every day. We see our members under attack. We see people losing benefits. We see what we have to do to maintain benefits. We do not have enough power. But I'll tell you, when we are going to have enough power, and when we realize our power, and that is when every single worker has a good job, with a good wage, with a good pension, with good health and welfare benefits, a safe and healthy workforce, dignity and respect, and a voice on the job. When we get to that point, we'll stand up and say, yes, we have the power that we should because it's for everybody. And the other thing sometimes we forget is we're in a fight every day. We're different than a lot of groups. We are the only group left, in some cases, that can stand up to the concentration of wealth and power in this country. And it's our obligation to fight. And we're always going to be in a fight and a struggle, but it's for a righteous cause. Because we're not committed to the status quo. The easiest thing to do is just say, hey, everything's fine, leave it alone. But if you don't think everything's fine and you think things have to change, then we have to be in a fight. And if we're in a fight, sometimes it's not an easy thing to do, to have everyone kind of yelling at you all the time and telling you you're nuts and crazy and just leave everything alone. I just want to leave with a quote from Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist. And he kind of put it into perspective. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And they will continue till they are restrained with either words or blows, or both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. That's the battle that we're still in. So we have to fight. That's our obligation. We owe it to those who came before us. We owe it to those that are going to follow us. We have an obligation to get up every morning and fight for our members and fight for the workers of this country and this state. And Steve hit the nail on the head about staying united. Now, over the next year, there's going to be a lot of people coming to knock on your doors. And they're going to be seeking our support, and they're going to make promises. They're going to be with us all the time. We know from experience that's not always the case. We're a federation, and the affiliates are independent to make their own choices. But it's always better for us to be united. And it doesn't happen unless we work at it. So I would request, as we go forward over the next year, that when we make these decisions and these considerations, we pledge to each other in this room, no matter what union that we're from, we pledge to each other that no political leader should ever be allowed to divide us. Though attempts have been made in the past to do that to the American labor movement, whether it's by race, by ethnic groups, by gender, by sexual orientation, those have been resisted and opposed. Today, the flavor of the day is to divide us by the public sector versus the private sector. And we have an obligation to say, no, that doesn't happen in Rhode Island. A divided labor movement is a weakened labor movement. We cannot let it happen. That's our obligation to each other here. Some people are subtle about it, and some are more open, like the governor of New Jersey, who recently proudly said he's been able to divide the labor movement between the public sector and the private sector. So let's us, in this room again, say we are united as brothers and sisters. We're committed to a strong and a vibrant economy in Rhode Island, and we only get there when we are united. Thank you again for your vote of confidence, and I pledge to do that.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m. Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Island families. We hope you enjoy this evening's edition.
That's going to be a pretty good introduction to our next speaker. We are honored tonight to have Steve Tolman, who is the president of the Massachusetts AFL-CIO. And Steve was elected 2 years ago and got put under the gun right away and responded magnificently by uniting the labor movement in Massachusetts and being the person who put everything together to get Elizabeth Warren elected as the senator in Massachusetts to replace the other person who had kind of snuck in there. That was not an easy task. From the time he got elected, I think he worked on that right away. He's also someone that has had a political background. He was a state rep and a state senator. And when they were singing that song, I've been working on the railroad, he did that for 23 years. So he's been working on the railroad. Then he went into politics, and he's always been a part of the labor movement. The Mass AFL-CIO was smart enough to elect him in 2011, and I know we share in this room a lot of our locals and a lot of our members. Some live in Massachusetts, some of his members live in Rhode Island. We have a lot in common. We share a lot of the same laws and ideals and backgrounds. So with that, our brother, Steve Tolman, president of the Mass AFL-CIO.
Thank you very much. Thank you, George, very much. Good evening, brothers and sisters. Let me try that again. We at a casino or are we at a mass or what? Good evening, brothers and sisters. Now you're talking. It's an honor to be here. And as George said, my name is Steve Tolman, and I work with the railroad up at South Station for 23 years. And the first stop, if you got caught on the train, actually, after 128 in Back Bay, was Providence. And let me tell you something. Occasionally, I would slip out. I would get caught on that train accidentally to come down to your great city. But, you know, after hearing that video and seeing and feeling what I feel in this room here tonight, I got to tell you, I first want to thank Maureen and George for the invitation to come here tonight. But I think that's about all I want to use for my speech, because I want to talk to you from my heart. And there's good news and bad news to that. Sometimes I don't know when to shut up, but I know I got Armin right there. So I know they're going to tell me when it's time to shut up. And I know I got one vice president. I think Jimmy Riley's here from UFCW, one of my vice presidents. We have about 70 of them up in Massachusetts. Thank you, Jimmy. But brothers and sisters, I'm honored to be here today because it's an election for our good friend George Nee, or one might say a coronation, I don't know, because it sounds like everybody's on board here, but for good reason. And the reason I say that is I called my brother John. I'm the sixth of 8 children, and I was the 6th in 7 years, and my brother just above me is with the BLE, Brotherhood Locomotive Engineers, Teamsters. And in '88, he met George out in Iowa working for Mike Dukakis. And I said to John, I said, George, tell me a story about George. John, tell me a story about George. And today, he said, I'll tell you, Steve. In 1996, I think it was 95 and 96, we had the critical incident stress bill for engineers when they hit somebody on the train. Our primary piece of legislation. I went down and met with George, with the group of us and a couple of his friends, and within 6 months it passed in Rhode Island. It passed in Rhode Island, now it's federal law. That's 6 months it passed in Rhode Island. That's what John said to me. And I knew when I worked on the railroad, I worked for the 23 years, and then I ran for rep in 1990 and lost, and then I ran again in 94 and I won. And I served 2 terms in the House and 7 terms in the Senate. And my friends in the labor movement was 20 years as a union rep in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. And my friends in labor called me and asked me to run for the president about 2.5 years ago. And they did that because they knew of my commitment and dedication to this movement. And they also knew that I would take it serious, most importantly, because we are under attack, brothers and sisters. Let me ask you this. When in hell did it ever become fashionable not to have a pension? That it's, oh, you should feel guilty because you have a decent pension. When did it ever become acceptable to sit back and let our seniors go bankrupt because they get a medical illness and the insurance company doesn't cover them enough? When? Well, should we be embarrassed that we worked state jobs, did make a lot of money, but had good benefits? And all of a sudden, you hear education reform, transportation reform, pension reform, health care reform. And all this is happening when the top 1% in this nation controls about 60%, 40%, the top 1%. The top 1%, brothers and sisters, is 3 million people, 3.2 million people. That 60%, which we dangle with, is about 190 million people. We have the boots on the ground, and we can compete with their money if we are organized and stick together. But we got to put the little stuff that divides us aside and stand together. And with great leaders like George and certainly Maureen, we can do that. You know, in 1977, I got elected local chairman of my union. I went down to a meeting just like this, and my national president was speaking, Fred Kroll. He was the youngest guy ever elected to the executive council of the national AFL-CIO at the time. And he was the guy that was going to replace George Meany, those of you that are old enough to remember the legendary leader of the AFL-CIO. And Freddie succumbed to leukemia just 2 years later at 45 years old. But he was featured by Time magazine in 1979 as a future leader of America, not just the labor movement. And he was my mentor. And Freddie said from the podium that day, the role of a union representative is not just in the workplace. It's in the communities. It's in the schools. It's in the churches. It's in the central labor councils. And yes, the AFL-CIO. And he said it's in the political parties. Generally the Democratic Party, sometimes the Republican Party, and there was a hiss across the crowd. We certainly would hiss today, given their conduct in Washington. And Fred paused. And he said, you have to balance all that activity by being a good parent. Well, brothers and sisters, I had goosebumps the size of nickels. And I was bought into our movement, because that's who we are. The AFL-CIO and everyone in this room stands for everything that is right about America. But we have a race going on up in Boston right now, and George talked about Elizabeth Warren and what we did. And I'll tell you what, it wasn't Steve Tolman at the AFL-CIO. It was the laborers, it was the iron workers, it was the nurses, it was the teachers. It was the sanitation workers and AFSCME and SEIU and the carpenters, all of us working together. And Scott Brown thought he had it made. He thought, I served in the legislature with him. I met with him. And he said to me condescendingly in January of that year, Steve, we're going to keep the House. We're probably going to take the Senate. You're going to need a friend like me. And I said, Scott, you'll always be my friend, but I'm going to judge you by your record. And we did. And brothers and sisters, he bought into the right-wing Republican conservative bullshit. And Elizabeth Warren stood tall and got elected by standing up for working people. And who I believe is probably the best U.S. senator, she gets up now, and you know what she says? I'm proud to be from labor. And you know what, brothers and sisters? She also says that working people are taking it on the chin, and they're getting screwed in Washington. And she's standing up to the banks. And sometimes we got to all start standing up. And we got to hold hands, and we got to let Elizabeth Warren and the representatives that are going to fight for us know we're behind them. Because I'll tell you what, they will take our pensions away. They will bankrupt us. You see what these Republicans have done. They have no concern for anybody but ruining labor, because we are the only organized effort that can stand up. We are the only organized effort to stand up against the right-wing conservatives who want to break everything that we know and care and believe is dear to our hearts, because it's right. That's what that movie was about. We can no longer just represent people in the workplace. We have to broaden that to community access groups, to community activity. We have to get, like Fred Kroll said, back into the churches, back into the community, and most importantly, become allies. Because there's too much that unites us to let a few things divide us. Brothers and sisters, I'm going to close with a great quote of mine. Because as we press on for justice, and it's from Martin Luther King, 1956. And he said, as you press on for justice, be sure to move with dignity and discipline, using only the weapon of love. Let no man pull you so low as to hate him. Always avoid violence. If you succumb to the temptation of using violence in your struggle, unborn generations will be the recipient of a night of bitterness, of a bitter night, and your chief legacy will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos. God bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. There goes the speech. So much for the speech.
We've invited in Joe Fleming. You may have seen him on television from Fleming and Associates. He is, in my humble opinion, the only legitimate pollster in Rhode Island, the only credible pollster in Rhode Island. I'm going a little overboard here, Joe. Don't get embarrassed. You know, I can do this. You can't. But Joe has been a pollster for a number of years. He's works with several of the television stations, and he's been doing polling for the labor movement for about 12 years now under the Working Rhode Island umbrella. And we have learned a lot from the work that he's done with us, and I thought it would be appropriate if we would bring him before you tonight, and so he could share his thoughts on why polling can help us understand what's happening in our own movement, also what's happening out in the community, so we can better respond and represent our members. So with that, Joe, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Okay. Thanks, George. Following Steve, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do a decent job after that presentation. That was outstanding. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm also a former union member of Local 930 in the city of Pawtucket, a school teacher. Retired now. Well, I go back many years with her. What I want to do is talk about how polling helps unions. The first thing is, keep in mind, a poll is nothing more than a snapshot of the public at that time. Polling information changes, and that's one reason why we do the poll, to see how people's views are at that time and if we could influence their opinion. When we do a survey, it's not of everybody. We might interview 400 or 500 registered voters in the state of Rhode Island and get their opinions. We do surveys on issues. We can do surveys on candidates. We can do surveys on people who say one thing. We can prove by the polling that it's not true. First thing I want to talk about is how can polling help the unions? Surveys, we do the issue ones. Issues that the unions want to talk about. We gauge public support for that. A lot of times you might not think there's public support, but there is support once we go in. Because what happens is you hear from just people who are involved in the process. We talk to everybody and get a cross-population view. Second one, job performance of elected officials. Obviously, having the right people in office is very important for the unions. We get their job performance, see how people view them. When we look at them, we don't look at just an overall thing. We look at them by sex, by age, by income, by political party, by union status. Public sector union employees, private sector union employees. So we can break down each candidate or individual by how each subgroup looks at them, and that tells us a lot. It tells us which groups that we can move. And as we talk tonight, you'll see how some groups, when we find out how they view an issue, it gives George and the union a great arm to go into the General Assembly and say, look, all the Democrats support this issue. The Republicans don't. You want to support this. It's going to help you be reelected. Also, impressions of union workers. We've been polling years and years, asking people, how do you view policemen? How do you view firefighters? How do you view nurses? and we have those results, and we've been looking at those year after year. We're going to talk about that. What I want to do is talk about 3 or 4 different case studies that we've done. The first one goes back to 2010. You might remember the city of East Providence. Back in 2010, the villain in East Providence, if you go to the next slide, thanks, was the labor unions. The council and the school committee kept saying the unions are the problem in East Providence. We have a financial problem because of the unions. Well, we were commissioned to do a survey in East Providence to find out some information. We found out some very interesting stuff. On the first slide, we found out that 52% of the people thought East Providence was moving in the wrong direction. Only 26% thought it was moving in the right direction. So as a result, now maybe the council was right. Maybe it's the unions that's the problem. But on the next slide, we said to the people, okay, it's going in the wrong direction. Who do you blame? 58% of the voters blame the council and the school committee, not the unions. The unions were only blamed by 20-some% of the voters. So right away, the message that was being sent to East Providence was wrong. It wasn't the correct message. It wasn't the unions the problem. It was the school committee, and it was the city council. As a result, candidates were engaged to run for school committee, to run for city council. Remember, Joe Larissa was the big mayor in East Providence, big anti-union person. Well, Billy Conley ran against him. The unions got candidates for all the council seats, all the school committee seats. As a result of other questions from this survey, they would identify issues they could talk about, and guess what? In 2010, they were all eliminated from office. And Joe Larissa got beat by 2,000 votes. But the unions invested to find out what messages were going to work to the voters of East Providence. And they found the message out. They were angry. Joe Larissa was blaming everyone but not coming up with solutions. They used those messages. Another issue that we did in 2012 was the T.F. Green Airport runway expansion. There was a lot of talk in Warwick about the runway maybe not being expanded because neighbors were upset with this. Again, the runway expansion is going to mean a lot of union jobs to work there. Well, what the unions did was they said, let's look at it and see if people in Warwick do want the runways to be expanded. We did that, and we found out that 56% of the voters in Warwick wanted it to be expanded. 42% were opposed. There was strong support, we found out, from seniors, people over the age of 60, males, and independent voters. Also, we show you breakdowns by the age groups. You can see how strong the last column is the seniors, how strongly they supported it. But then we asked the voters of Warwick if the airport is a good neighbor to the city of Warwick. 70% said yes, they are a good neighbor. So right away, people have a good opinion of the airport. The big thing was the council was going to bring a lawsuit to stop the expansion, which would have held it up in court for a number of years. So we asked the question, do you support a lawsuit for the runway extension? 37% of the voters in East Providence and Warwick said yes. 54% said no. Right away, people weren't supporting it. We also checked other things. We said to the voters, if you knew Mayor Aberdeen worked with the FAA to make sure safeguards are in place, would you be more inclined to support it? People said yes. If you knew it was going to create more tax dollars, people said yes. If you knew business and labor were supporting the expansion, would you say yes? People said yes. Well, what this did, this survey gave the council cover to go and say, yes, let's approve the expansion. Let's not do the lawsuit. As a result, there's no lawsuit and the airport expansion is going forward. Again, another issue the unions invested in, and they got the message across to the elected officials in the city of Warwick. So that was a big plus for them. Then in 2013, one of the union's favorite subjects, teacher union survey, Commissioner Deborah Gist, a favorite of the NEA and AFT, kept saying, well, yeah, I know the union leadership don't like me, but the rank and file members like me. They really do. So I got to give the unions credit. They said, let's go out and find out if the rank and file like it. We don't believe they do. So the first thing we did, we asked a question about the job performance of Commissioner Gist. And 24% said she was doing an effective job. 73% said she was doing not an effective job. Notice the three charts up there. The newer members of the unions, 59% said she was not doing an effective job. People who worked 10 to 19 years, 74% said she was not. Those who've been in the system many, many years, who have gone through a lot of people, 77% said she was not doing an effective job. She also said, I communicate with the teachers. Well, we asked that question. Now, this survey was done just to union members. 90% says she was doing a fair or poor job. If you were teaching more than 20 years, 95% says she was doing a fair or poor job. We asked teachers if they're better off now under GIST than before. 85% said they were not. We asked about the kneecap. Should it be required for graduation? 72% said it should not. Then we asked a battery of other questions to union members. Then the last question we asked was, should Commissioner Gist be reappointed? 7% of the union members said she should. Unfortunately for her, 85% said she should not be reappointed. Senior teachers who have been in more than 20 years, 89% said no. We were in female teachers, both unions, 85% said no. Female teachers, 86% said no. What we were able to show with the survey, and the unions released this publicly, and when they released the survey, that's changed the whole dynamic of her reappointment. People started to question things because they saw that the rank and file teachers definitely were not in her corner. So again, it gave both the NAA and AFT some ammunition to use in their fight, especially when we're talking with the Board of Education, to try to show them that she doesn't have the rank and file support. The other thing we do is we do statewide surveys, usually about once a year. And these surveys run about 18 minutes long. So we keep people on the phone for 18 minutes, testing all sorts of issues. And I just want to go over a couple of things that we've done in the last survey. This is from the 2013 survey. The first slide is the view of the workers. And it's probably very hard to read, but if you look at it, people like nurses, fire, police, social workers, their favorability rating is like 95%. The voters around have a favorable opinion of them. And we've polled this question for like 6 years. The opinions don't change. It stays pretty constant year for year unless there's something that happens within that field that might make it jump up or down, but it goes back the following year. All the groups we checked, teachers, social workers, city and town workers, state workers, I think the lowest group had like a 69 or 70% favorable rating. The voters in Rhode Island like the union workers, there's no question. I say classroom teacher, yes. I say nurse, 98, 99% some years. Police officers, firefighters, all these people have very strong support. All the subgroups support them very strongly. The next thing is we'll poll on issues that might affect that the unions might be talking about. Here, the first one is increased child care eligibility assistance. Look at the number, like 67% wanted to increase the assistance for child care. This was a bill that was in the General Assembly. This gave the unions ammunition to go to the General Assembly members and say, look, we have support for this from the rank and file. And what happens is 86% of Democrats supported this, which is higher than the statewide number. And as you know, it's a very strong Democratic state. So if you're talking to a senator or a Democrat in Providence, Pawtucket, Woonsocket, Central Falls, they don't care how the Republicans feel on this issue. Their fight is in a primary. If they know 86% of their supporters support this, it's going to make them more inclined to support it. The next slide was a piece of legislation that passed this year. Minimum wage. Should we increase the minimum wage? 80% of all residents said, yes, we should. Democrats, 96%. Even 64% of Republicans said we should. We only have about a 12% Republicans in the state of Rhode Island, but there was support for it. And again, it showed the General Assembly, if you pass this, it's not going to hurt you. It's not going to have a negative impact on you. The next slide we talk about was the kneecap. And we can see a majority of voters, 54% said it should not be used for graduation. And again, it gives the unions more power. The strongest opposition for the kneecap was from voters under the age of 50, the people that would have children in the school system. And that's where the strongest support was. 64% of Democrats oppose this. So all this gives the unions ammunition to use during the General Assembly session. The last slide is an interesting one. It's on binding arbitration. 56% of Rhode Islanders said they would support binding arbitration for teacher contracts. And we laid it out explaining what the binding arbitration was. And again, an issue like this, it could change as the debate heats up. But before there's a debate, we find 56% said they would support it, 37% would oppose it. Strong support from voters between the ages of 40 and 49 and from female voters. As you can see, we can pick up where the support comes from. We know what groups to work with. If mailings have to be done, we can target specific groups to get the message across where we know the support is. The last thing I want to talk about is the media. Let's go with a real favorite subject of the union, talk radio. We asked people, do you listen to talk radio? Only 17% of Rhode Island residents said they listen to it a lot. 40% said sometimes, 43% said never. In this survey, we didn't ask them who you listen to, but in past surveys we did. Parisi is #1, and the rest of them are way down the pack. You know, somebody like John DePietro was way down on the low end when we polled this question a couple of years back. But who listens to it? Voters over the age of 60, 20%. Republicans, 23%. Democrats, 12%. Independents wasn't that high. But the popularity is going down. In 2010, it was 22%. In 2011, it was 23%. And in 2012, it was 16%, and now it's at 17%. So it's going downhill. Talk radio has some impact, but it's the same people listening every day. And our survey shows they're mostly elderly, and they're Republicans. And if they're Republicans, they're not voting for union candidates anyway. You never had their vote, and you never will have their vote.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.